Okay, let's get to the business if we can, Dr. Janil. Straight to it, 7%, the maximum allowable. Explain why it has to be 7% when it was previously, just over 4%? Why not 5%, 6%? You went right to the max.
Yes. Well, we have a fair formula. So there's a publicly explained, transparent, objective way of deciding how much the fare should go up. And it needs to take into account manpower costs, energy costs, and various other things. The key issue is that costs for the operators have risen quite significantly, up to 30% over the last few years. And our fares have not in any way kept up with that. Now, part of that is because historically we haven't imposed a fare increase on the basis of the formula. We've taken a portion of the formula. But the last year and then going forward this year again, we're going to have to impose the full increase from the fare formula.
So are you saying you've held off and it's come to a point where you have no choice?
Well, historically, that's exactly what's happened, that we've had the opportunity to increase fares a lot more and we haven't. But as a result of which the gap between the costs to the operators and how much revenue the fares have been generating, the gap has increased and we need to find ways to close that gap. So part of this way of doing so is that we need this fare increase.
Okay. Can I just look at some numbers here from a past report? In the months, 12 months to end March 2019, losses for SMRT trains alone hit $155 million. It's almost double from a year ago. That's what they reported earlier this year. And the spending was on repairs and maintenance, accounting for 71% of rail fare revenue. Just to put things into perspective, I have to tell you, Dr. Janil, lots of questions have been coming through, people saying that SMRT seems to be profitable, but it doesn't seem to be the case at all. I just want to clarify that we just did our check.
Yeah. Let's get Timothy Wong into the conversation as well. We've talked about the formula. Let's talk about apart from the formula, which is economics. From an economic standpoint, do you have anything, that you dispute or anything to add that, that makes this conversation more salient?
I think there are a couple of things to talk about from an economic perspective. One is, let's presume that the operators are efficient. If the operators are fully efficient in their operations, there's still justifications for us to subsidize public transport because we want to get people out of cars. We don't like the pollution that comes from the tailpipes of cars and things like that. And I think from that perspective, the Singapore conversation is not as controversial. People agree that the government should subsidize, and hopefully people acknowledge that the government does subsidize a large proportion of the costs. Where the concerns come in is whether the operators are operating efficiently and how much we should be helping ensure sustainability or profitability of these firms over time. We want them to be as cost efficient as possible, but at the same time, if we don't allow fares to increase so that they don't have revenue, as cost efficient as they are, they're not going to be profitable.
Okay,
right? So the big question is,
So are they, Dr. Janil? Maybe you can chip in here and tell us whether or not you feel that they're operating as they should be, efficiently as possible.
Well, the key marker of that is the improvement in reliability that we've seen, and we've seen this across all the rail networks. And it's a 7 times improvement in reliability over a relatively short period of time. So the investments in maintenance and engineering that Timothy was referencing, I mean, it sounds sort of very hardware specific, or somehow that we spend the money on some kind of capability. But actually, the key issue there is the hiring of talented manpower. I mean, basically, there's been a ramp up in the engineering talent and capability within these companies to be able to do a much better type of predictive and preventive maintenance. And that, I mean, it's a manpower cost really that's driving quite a lot of this.
Okay, so help us make sense of this. Okay, there's a balance that you're trying to achieve here between, I guess, protecting consumers. You want to make sure that they can continue to afford it, but you want to make sure that the operators can survive as well.
Yes.
So how did you come about to finding or achieving this balance?
Well, as it is today, as Timothy mentioned, the taxpayers already subsidize very heavily our public transport, and with the taxpayers taking on the burden of all the capital expenditure, all the infrastructure investments. Originally, when we had our public transport system, the idea was then to impose a certain amount of cost discipline on everybody. The commuter would end up paying for their own fares, as it were, their own portion. But over time, the increase in costs, but slowing down of the increase in fares, has meant that the taxpayer has continued to increasingly subsidize more and more. So today, with the expenditure that's out there, effectively the taxpayer is paying about $1 for every single public transport trip. Every single public transport trip, you take it all in, the amount that every taxpayer is subsidizing is about $1. That's a substantial amount.
I want to ask at this point about this model that we have. I suppose it's relatively new in the context of our public transport history, where the government takes care of the buses and the trains, the infrastructure and so forth, and the operators bid.
Yes, we've been updating our model as we go along.
So is it working?
Well, it depends on how, it's never going to be complete. It's a work in progress. But is it moving in the right direction? And I would say yes. If you look at the reliability as one marker of is it working, the answer is yes, it's certainly improving quite a lot. You mentioned buses, and the service levels of buses have significantly improved as well, partly by our bus services expansion program, but also by a transition to this bus contracting model. So I think palpably on the ground, the experience for a commuter has improved. Now, what we also need to do, as Timothy mentioned, is now pay a little bit of attention to the financial sustainability of the operators. And this is part of that effort.
Okay. Tim, your comments on this model? Yeah.
Actually, Tim, I want to ask you about the balance between helping the operators with the rising costs and then protecting the consumers. We haven't heard you weigh in on that one.
Yeah, I think that there's a big concern here if we create an environment in which operators, current operators or operators in the future, think that it's not possible to make profits, right? That's a huge concern. And so if we currently the operators are not making profits on their rail operations, if we allow that to continue for too long, we send this perception globally that if you decide to bid for a contract to operate a rail line in Singapore, we can't guarantee you'll make any money. And then if we have that sort of a perception, it's going to be very difficult to create a competitive environment for operations in the rail industry as we do in the bus industry, right? We have more and more operators in the bus industry. And I think that has been a good thing. So,
okay. Yeah. I just want to bring the attention to some of the messages that have been coming through to see these. I've got this comments that SMRT, SBS transit buses, some people feel that they shouldn't be focused on making profits at all. What do you have to say about this?
So I guess the alternative then is the government takes over all of the operations and runs it. And there are I guess I wouldn't say that I could guarantee you that a fully government-run operations is any worse or any better. As Janil has mentioned, these sort of operational, organizational type structures of the industry are all works in progress, and no country in the world has figured this out yet.
But actually, I would just jump in there. Look, no country in the world has a purely government done everything. I mean, it depends on where you draw the line. And ultimately, you do have contractors and vendors and operators, which may be directly hired by the government under some models. That doesn't automatically make it better than the model that we have. We do have a fair amount of government involvement in this space. And it's not as if it's a hands-off approach by any means. But I think having that right type of competitive dynamic within the operating space, it does help to reduce costs, and it creates opportunities.
Okay, so you feel that you're on the right track. This mix is working at this time. I mean, obviously, it's going to be an evolving process.
The other dimension of it working really is how do our fares compare to other cities? So even though today we've now improved our reliability to it's like in the top 3, top 5 best in the world. I mean, it's a really remarkable turnaround. Our fares are still one of the lowest for cities in the world. I mean, and it's really literally you can count on one hand the number of cities who have fares that are lower than ours. So it's effective in that sense that we have been able to improve reliability, deliver a service, and yet keep the cost contained. Okay. But there's this other extra component, which is why we're here today, which is this has been at the cost of the sort of operating model of the operators, as it were, the financial sustainability of the operators. And so we need to make a little bit of an adjustment there to the fares.
I also want to ask you about the fact that you've kept this cap of 7% all the way to 2021, I believe.
The fare formula.
Yeah, the formula. Sorry, it's kept at 7%. Is that just in case, or is this a genuine calculation?
No, the 7% is for this year's exercise, right? So the fare formula takes into account manpower costs, and energy costs, and a variety of other things. So next year's fare exercise, we'll sort of plug the numbers into the fare formula, and then we'll see what the number comes out.
Okay.
So that 7% is for this year's fare exercise.
Okay. So it's not going to be 7% again until 2021. Okay. Thank you for correcting that.
Hey, thanks for the calls. Thanks for the calls that have been coming through to 669-11938. You're welcome to call through. Dr. Janil and Timothy Wong can take calls. So we were talking, models and percentages just a little bit earlier, and then I have to say, Dr. Janil and Tim, in 3 seconds, you get 20 messages coming in here, right? And all of them are like, why? But then there's one here that says, good morning. Increased fare is fair. Let's give credit where credit is due. And the current transport has actually improved from where it was. So isn't that nice? And I think a lot of people are also very happy about the polytechnic student situation
indeed.
too.
This is something, that has, I guess, happened for a long time, that request has come in for many years, to give them concessionary fares as well, polytechnic students, diploma students. It's happened. So why the change of heart? It's good news, but we just want to understand why it happened.
Well, firstly, it didn't just happen. We had previously normalized the polytechnic fares for the passes. So we made the polytechnic students have access to the passes the same as the other students as well. What we've now extended is to the individual fare tickets, as it were.
Okay.
Well, basically, it's because we have a bit more confidence that we can do the cross-subsidy from the people who pay the full fares to the people who pay concessionary fares better. The ability to implement the full fare increase formula 2 years in a row, that is also part of that confidence.
Okay.
And so what you find now is that you have a difference in how much the fares go up for different groups of people. So today, for example, the people who have concessionary passes, their fares are only going up by 4 cents. Whereas the tourists, the people who pay a single cash fare, their fares are going up by a much larger amount, up to 20 cents. And the adult single card-based fare is only 9 cents. So you can see a clear differentiation. And what that means is that the people who are able to pay are effectively paying more, so that the people who need a little bit more assistance, and that includes the 1 in 2 Singaporeans that enjoy some kind of concessionary pass today. Half of our commuters enjoy a concession pass. And so now we can include polytechnic students. Basically, we've increased the number of people who can enjoy that type of concession pass because the model for cross-subsidy is working a bit better.
Okay, makes sense.
Diploma and polytechnic students, but then there's Eddie who wrote in to say, are there concessions for private school students? Have you missed this group out?
No, you're absolutely right. Wherever you decide that you're going to give a concession pass, you can always make a case that there are other people.
Yeah.
But you see, the concession passes are not the only way in which we're helping people to afford public transport. So we do want to give the concession pass. It's one way of assisting. But the other big way that we're assisting is our public transport voucher scheme, which we've had for a number of years. And, the operators also contribute to those. But what we're doing this year is we're expanding the eligibility criteria. So we've gone from 1 in 10 households to now 1 in 5 households. We've doubled the number of households that are eligible, expanded the number of people that can be covered by the scheme, and we've also increased the amount that we're giving out from $30 to $50. Okay. So, Eddie, you can apply for public transport vouchers. Come down to your community center and we'll see how we can help you.
Okay, so message for you there, Eddie.
Yeah, I want to talk about this 7% fare increase, right? This translates, as we understand it, to about $130 million in total fare revenue. 18.8 million to SBS Transit, about 40 million going to SMRT. So is this money just for them to cover their costs, or are there conditions attached to it as well?
Well, indeed. So part of the conditions with respect to the money is certainly how much they contribute to the public transport fund, which supports the vouchers. But on a larger perspective, the conditions that you're talking about are really the service level agreements. It's not so directly tied to this increase in fare revenue, because that service level, that's an operating turnover of billions. But But certainly, yes, there are very strict conditions about how SMRT, SBST, the operators across our public transport network have to deliver on reliability, the quality of service, the way they deal with complaints, the way they deal with lost and found items, how they engage with the customers. So there's a whole series of conditions associated with being a public transport licensee.
Okay. I mean, are you happy in general with the way our public transport operators are operating? I mean, are they, utilizing every cent that comes their way in the most efficient way possible?
I believe so, and I think the fact that they've had such an improvement in the reliability is a marker of that. Could we do more? The answer is we can always do more, but the question is at what cost? What's it going to cost us to do more? I think the engineers particularly have made great strides on the ground to take us from where we were just only a few years ago to the situation we enjoy today.
Okay, Tim, you're the economist. You agree that they are doing a good job maximizing every single
everything
cent?
that's coming through? Yeah.
Well, I'm not on the ground watching these trains and these operators work, so I can't speak with that much authority. What I will say is the increase in revenue that will come from this is certainly not a bailout for these firms. If you look at the numbers, the amount of losses that they're incurring, the amount of increase in revenue that they will receive, they will still have to do a lot more to become profitable. So from that perspective, the government's incentives here are not to sort of fully solve these problems by just raising fares.
All right, I just want to bring this conversation forward, if I can, to talk about, the fact that every time, a dollar is used to subsidize transport, it means a dollar taken away from from somewhere else, like maybe education, healthcare. How do you reconcile this, if you like, Dr. Janil?
Well, I mean, this is fundamental to all of our challenges with budgeting, that you have to make a decision about what you spend on and what you, as a result, don't spend on. But I think that the argument is not really whether or not we should subsidize public transport. And the reason is that transport enables so much of the rest of the things that we do. If you want to get to school, then you need to be transported there, your healthcare, and so forth. So having a well-functioning public transport system, I think, is going to be key to just the normal day-to-day functions that we have here in our lives in Singapore, but also to our future, the kind of city that we want to be, a dynamic, growing economy, creating opportunities. And you're going to have a well-functioning public transport system, and that's going to require some degree of subsidies. Okay. So it's not that we won't subsidize public transport, we will. It's not that we won't find a way to help the most vulnerable and commuters, we will. The question is, how much is the fair amount, and no pun intended. Or maybe that pun should be intended.
This is why you host that show.
Clearly, you've got the lines.
Clearly, yeah.
It's not meant to be stand-up comedy. But you're right that if we overdo this, we are taking funds from elsewhere, and we do need to spend on healthcare, on education, and many other things as well.
One quick question before we go to traffic. KM Sim asks, what incentives are in place to ensure that bus and train operators remain focused on their public mission and not just on profits?
Well, the way that we do so is through these agreements that we have as a condition of licensing. We make it very, very clear that they must deliver on not just when your buses turn up or when your trains turn up or how many minutes between them, but on a very, very detailed expectation with respect to engineering reliability. And so our LTA teams go down and we are literally there next to the engineers as they do these things to make sure that they are focused on maintenance, focused on prevention, focused on capacity development and capability development. And we're not just only looking at how much profit they make and then stepping back and letting them do the rest. We're right there with them as they deliver on their service.
Transport economist?
Your observations?
Any comments?
I think that the service agreements are certainly the right way to go about with this, right? You need to make sure that a certain level of a certain standard of service is provided. I think the big question here is, what should that level be? If we want these standards to be high, and I think in Singapore they are relatively high, there is a cost associated with that. So at the end of the day, it boils down to, as a society, what is our willingness to pay for a certain level of service, and how do we figure out the right balance of how much we pay relative to, because we could always trade off here and have lower fares and just less reliable service, right? So we have to decide as a society what level of service we want and how much we want to spend on it.
You've mentioned this yourself, Dr. Janil, subsidizes public transport heavily over the next 5 years, $1 billion on public bus subsidies and close to another $1 billion on the rail assets. Per year. Is this a situation that you expect, to continue indefinitely, or is there some point do you have an end state or a preferred state?
Well, our general principle is that when it comes to the operating assets, the depots, the stations, the rails, and so forth, that is something that should be paid out of the taxpayers' purse, as it were, and that really what we want is to impose a significant amount of discipline in terms of the business model with respect to the operations, and that's how we split it. So today, government, on behalf of the taxpayer, takes on all of that burden for the capital expenditure. Building stuff, right? So that's the key way to think of it. The building of the stuff comes out of the taxpayers' funds. The question is now running the stuff, should that come out of the commuter, the person who taps in and out, or should it come out of the taxpayer who may or may not be using the public transport system? And so today, running the stuff is subsidized about 50% by the taxpayer. And that's not how we originally set it up. Originally, we set it up so that about all of the running of the stuff was going to be done by the commuter.
Okay.
But as costs have risen and we've had to increasingly subsidize that part of it, increasingly the taxpayer has provided a subsidy.
Okay, so this is out of necessity because it's rising too quickly? Is that a fair statement?
Well, partly. Costs have been rising too quickly and whether we wanted a way to make sure that we dealt with making sure public transport was available and reliable. And that's what we've delivered so far. And we've got to find ways to keep this sustainable going forward. So will there be subsidy for public transport? The answer is yes. I mean, you're going to have to continue to build and stations and lines and depots and deal with the stuff. But you also need to find a way to make sure that when we run the stuff, it's done in a cost-efficient way. And I'm sure, as Timothy would agree, that we have to get the right kind of business model in order to get the financial discipline.
You want to just add to that, Tim?
Yeah, I would say that from an economic perspective, even from an operations perspective, there are justifications for subsidies. And these come from the fact that we want to get people out of cars because this is just an inefficient mode. And if we don't, the negative externalities from cars will overwhelm society. So that's one. Two, the way that public transportation services work is, in economics, we call this the mooring effect. So there is the fact that if you have more people using the line, you can make your services more frequent. When you make the services more frequent, more people will be attracted to this line because you wait less, right? And you want to encourage this sort of cycle of events to occur because then life gets better for everybody, right? Because you get more quality service. And to encourage that, you need some level of subsidy to keep that going. The big question, I think, with Singapore is not really should we subsidize, it's how much we should subsidize. And that really is a tricky question.
Right.
But I think we're going in the right direction, though, because our public transport ridership continues to grow. And the car ownership, our vehicle population is capped, and the number of households that have access to a car are starting to reduce. So I think year on year, we're seeing more and more people take advantage of both our structure as well as our costs to then choose public transport as their way of getting around town. So I think we're moving in the right direction.
Yes, I agree 100% there. There are two ways that you can get people out of cars and into public transit. One is make public transit cheaper. One is make sure that people who drive cars pay for the costs that are associated with cars. And Singapore has done that and continues to do that. And with ERP 2.0, which we don't have to get into today.
Can we not? I think it's a little heavy because I think people want to talk about PMDs today. But before we do that, let's just talk about the commuters themselves, those actually using public transport. Can you give some practical ways that they can save on their transport expenses? We've already talked about the transport vouchers, but we know there are pre-peak discounts and all that. Dr. Janil.
Indeed. So pre-peak discounts are a big way to save. If you are traveling before the peak hour starts, you save 50 cents, or there used to be a trial where it was free, but that was a trial. But now it's a 50-cent discount. So it's a significant saving.
Okay.
If you can travel off peak, it's good for you and it's good for the rest of the commuters as well because you reduce the loading at the peak hours. The other thing is, as our network has built out, a lot of new connections have been made available. So there may well be a faster, shorter way to get to where you want to go. And it's worth looking at some of the transport apps and working out what your route is so that now the shorter your route, the less that you pay.
Oh, okay.
The third way to think about it is to buy a pass. If you're a heavy user of public transport, then the pass caps your monthly maximum usage, monthly maximum costs, I beg your pardon, but doesn't cap your usage. You can just keep using the pass.
Okay.
So that's 3 big ways in which you can save.
Arnold, you always link being car light with using bicycles and PMDs.
Absolutely. I mean, this is something we've talked about a lot. You know, the fact that if you want to be car light, you got to make your public transport system as efficient as possible. In particular, it's that last mile. You know, when you get off the bus or the train, you have to still get home. And it could be if you're lucky 100 meters away, or it could be maybe 2 kilometers if you're not so lucky, right? So which brings us to this question, Dr. Janil. You have mentioned the possibility of banning PMDs completely if user behavior does not improve. And obviously there are sound reasons for what you said, given the fact that people have died because of improper usage of the PMDs.
There's a community of 100,000 at least PMD users here in Singapore, and they're not taking this very well. What do you have to say to them?
Well, I can understand where they're coming from, and I'm sure there's more than 100,000 because it's it's about 90,000 that were registered in
yes.
June, and I think there's quite a lot that's still unregistered. But let me get back to where you started, Donald. I mean, we do believe in this last mile, first mile connectivity, and the real issue is that today most people, and for the foreseeable future, they're going to do their first mile, last mile connectivity on foot. They need to have the confidence that they can walk on the pedestrian paths safely and not be worried about having injuries and so forth.
Okay.
So yes, PMDs we think have a role to play. Yes, they can be useful if they're used responsibly, but our primary focus has to be that the footpaths have to be safe.
Yep.
Now, the vast majority of PMD users are indeed responsible, and I think we shouldn't straight away have a knee-jerk reaction because of a small number of people who have behaved badly, but we do want to send the signal that while we are building out the infrastructure, it's going to take some time in order to sort of do this separated traffic and really rebuild parts of our city to see that car light vision. That's going to take some time, but while we're doing that, we need safe footpaths,
sure.
and we'll do what it takes to get those footpaths safe.
Okay.
We don't particularly think a ban is what we need to do right now, but it's part of our consideration, and it's something that we have as a tool if it becomes necessary.
I mean, I'm a little bit puzzled as to why it's so difficult. I mean, it seems the logical thing you would do is to make sure there are checks when they're imported, so you make sure those that come in meet the specifications. Obviously, there's enforcement which you can do to a certain degree on the roads. And then, of course, there's, I guess, education and awareness, right? Doesn't it all come together, and we should reach that point where everyone becomes, responsible users?
Yeah, no, I think I have a job for you at MOT. You just articulated our entire strategy. No, that's exactly what we're doing. That's exactly what you're doing. But it takes time to do that. I mean, my colleague, SMS Lampimin, he announced just a few months ago what we're doing over the next few months. And indeed, exactly that. We're registering the devices. Once you start registering the devices, you can talk about which ones are compliant and non-compliant, and we want to get the non-compliant ones off the road. Then we've offered this incentive for disposal. Then we're talking about whether or not we need to license the rider. Then we need to think about insurance. These are some of the recommendations that have come in. You put all of these things together and you're exactly spot on. We will then be able to look at and control devices, riders, and behavior, as a result of which we hope to make everything safer.
Okay, so how long do you think this will take?
Well, it's being progressively rolled out. By the middle of next year, we'll have quite a lot of the processes in place, and quite a lot of the devices will have passed through the registration process and everything. So it's not years we're talking about, it's months in the first instance. But the other part is the infrastructure. If you're really talking about building these shared paths and increasing the amount of space available, that's going to take a lot longer. And so the question is behavior going to improve just in the next couple of months?
Probably not. That's my call anyway.
By Christmas, maybe?
Is it going to take, a lot longer for behavior to improve? And do we need to be really quite strict to make sure that the behavior improves before our infrastructure gets built?
Yeah.
And that's the reason I made my comment in Parliament.
All right. And I guess in these early days of PMD usage in Singapore in the last 24 hours, we just saw an errant seller of PMDs who'd been modifying the batteries and such being taken out. You roll your eyes there, Dr. Janil.
No, the risk here is huge.
Yes.
The risk is huge. I mean, but people get on a device that can go at 80 kilometers an hour.
It's unbelievable.
And then they're doing that mixed in with people. They're not wearing a helmet themselves. I mean, you wouldn't imagine riding a motorbike at 50 kilometers an hour without a helmet today.
We have a comment from Nilesh Jadev on PMDs. He says, the only sustainable solution to all the challenges is to provide the necessary infrastructure upgrades to allow PMDs and bicycles to have their own paths.
That's the direction we're going in. That's the direction we want to go
And he
in.
says that, look, he believes that bicycles are the most carbon and energy efficient transport mode.
Yeah, no, I'm sold on that last bit. I mean, I like my bicycle, and I'm quite a supporter of cycling, but not everybody likes it. And people want to use a PMD who wouldn't otherwise have that opportunity for mobility. I can understand where that's coming from as well.
Timothy Wong, transport economist, your view on PMDs and their future here in Singapore?
I think what we're seeing from these last couple of months is that we really need to be working towards separated infrastructure, right? We need to have separate lanes for these people because it's just too difficult to have them interfacing on the same footpaths, especially in Singapore, where the footpaths, the width of the footpaths, really have been designed solely for pedestrian walking. So yeah, all of the things we talk about, new regulations and licensing and stuff. That is especially important now, but I think the moment the infrastructure comes in, I think a lot of that will be less of a concern, because when these people are on separate footpaths, they can go at higher speeds. They'll still need to be safe, but the level of sort of expertise needed to sort of guide their way through will be a little lower than it is.
I mean, NUS is a great place to use PMDs. I actually see it quite often.
Very hilly, so it's
hilly,
nice to use these
walking
things,
up can be a bit of a challenge.
Oh, come on, it's a good workout.
For you, maybe. All right, gentlemen, I think we will have to wrap the show. I thank you very much for joining us this morning, Dr. Janil Puthucheary, Senior Minister of State for Transport, as well as Comms and Information, and also Timothy Wong, who is a transport economist from NUS. Gentlemen, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.